Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. All right, it's a new year, and welcome back to another episode of Extension Calling.
Extension Calling 2022. Here we go.
2022. Hope everybody had a safe and happy holiday and is staying healthy. We finally got some snow, so I am super excited about that because I love snow.
I am moderately excited because I don't care one way or the other.
Moderately excited. That sounds just like you, Dan.
I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion. Too much snow is bad. A little bit of snow, take it or leave it.
Yeah, too much snow can.
I'm more of a ground freezing fan than snow fan.
Well, snow is kind of like a first step towards that, I think. I don't know. It's
sometimes
a more visual
they're
step.
Correlated sometimes.
So I just got back from a program we did with some teachers on growing at school, like growing hydroponically. And so that was a really fun presentation, but some of the teachers still want that in-ground raised bed system. And so that's one of the things we want to talk about today. Give you the basic outline of how you can lay out a raised bed gardening system, either at a school, at a community garden, or at home.
Yeah, and people talk about raised bed gardenings as far as the best way to do something. But, when you actually break it down, some of the best advantages for a raised bed garden is that not everybody has ideal soils, and this is one way to get an ideal soil situation. But not only that, but you can get away with stuff like rocks and poor drainage, and put in the soil that you wish to have. Put in something that's more on the loam side than on the clay side, and having that drainage and giving you more control over not only that, but even weeds. So a lot of advantages. And I think the raised bed garden, the best thing about it, it gives us more control.
Yeah. And, another thing that a lot of people in this region have to deal with is sloping ground. And raised beds is another way that you can help level things off so that when you are irrigating, your water just doesn't run off of the crops and straight down the hill, that it actually stays where you want it to stay. So raised beds is another option for that.
So one of the things that we wanted to focus on today was looking at the construction material, how to build it so that it's a little bit more cost productive. It works for you, and it'll pay it back in a sense. Even buying the soil itself could be something that is really costly. And I've seen raised beds, Karens, that are just so deep, right? But honestly, a 6-inch raised bed might do you just fine.
Yeah, a lot of it depends on what you're growing. If you want to grow potatoes or something that really needs access to a deep, like carrots, something that grow deep, you're going to need a deeper raised bed for a crop like that. But if you're just growing lettuces or something like that, and even crops that do have a deeper root system, remember that unless you're putting these raised beds on concrete or on a paved parking lot, which is possible and totally doable, you just have to have a couple other things built in. Those plants are still going to have access to that soil that's underneath the raised bed. So keep that in mind, depending on where you're putting it. If I'm putting it on a blacktop surface, I may just ease toward that deeper bed to start with, just so that I could have access to that extra soil depth should I want to grow something that has a bigger root system than a head of lettuce.
That's right. One of the things that we didn't touch on early, and I just thought of it because you said lettuce, the raised bed allows you to place it where you want it. Mm-hmm. And we had a speaker for our Master Gardener program last year, and one of the things that he said was some of the hardest arguments to have with schools that want raised bed gardens is where to put them. Because the school knows the perfect spot and knows what they want to grow, but they don't understand why that's not the ideal place. Access to water, access to sunlight, those things become very important when you're trying to place a garden somewhere. So think about that. Think about what you want to do with it, like what you want to grow, how far away like a watering hose is if you would like to use that as your water source as opposed to soaker hoses. You can actually make it harder for yourself just by forgetting a few key things in building your raised bed garden.
Exactly. Yeah. And, some of the schools that I have worked with, water access is a big issue. And being able to get that hose to the garden is really a critical factor because plants cannot live without water. And if you don't have an easy way to get water to the garden, then you're putting it in a bad spot. And sunlight's another big issue. You can't put it underneath the shade of a tree. Not only will the plants not grow well because of a lack of sunlight from the tree being in full leaf and shading that area, but also if you are putting an extra layer of soil on top of the root system of that tree, you're essentially smothering the roots of the tree, and they're going to grow up into your raised bed garden because they need access to the oxygen that's in the soil there. And so keep those things in mind when you don't want to put it underneath the drip line of a tree, which is the outside edge of where the shade stops, basically. You also want to check where your utilities are. So you may not see them, they may be underground, but if something happens, no, you're not going to be digging down in there. But if something happens and they have to come through and trench out that area, are they going to take out your entire garden? Now, that is a really long shot problem, but it is still good to be aware that that could be a potential issue and just to know if you are putting it out in an area where there may be some buried electrical lines or buried phone lines that company may need access at some point to that area.
That's a good point. You might not be digging, but you still might be in the way. But I did want to, I want to touch on the sunlight thing. For most things that we grow, full sun is the best.
Hmm.
But I will say, if you're doing, because you said lettuce, you brought in a whole new game here.
Oh, yeah.
Lettuce doesn't like full sun. Lettuce does like partially shaded. So one of the things that you can do is if you have like a wall that's on the south side or the west side where it's going to be shaded parts of the day, and that's easy to find out just by looking out there.
Yeah.
Mark a time, figure out okay, is it getting sunlight? Check. At what time is it not? And then you can jot that down. You can have a beautiful chart, very accurate chart at that. But you also want to be careful about pests, right? Because even if you have a wooded area, like the edge of a woods, on the south side of a garden that you're putting in, that might be great because it'll give you some shade, let's say, for a lettuce situation. But we have pests. Putting things close to the wooded lots will bring in deer, will bring in rabbits. So keep that in mind too. You're gonna have, just because it's a raised bed garden doesn't mean you get rid of the pests.
Yeah. And you still may have to put a fence around your garden, especially if you have a lot of deer pressure. But one of the animals that you don't typically have an issue with in a regular garden that you are more than likely going to have an issue with in a raised bed garden due to the loose soil is cats. It's your regular old house cat because that just becomes a great big litter box. And that's really, really frustrating because you have that fresh manure in there and you don't want to eat something that's got fresh manure on it. That's a food safety risk and it's just plain gross. So one of the things that we often recommend if you do have a cat issue is to either lay a layer of chicken wire down around the soil around your crops or to just fence it in like you would for deer and put some deer fencing around it, and that can help as well.
Yeah, I never thought about that. Cats.
Oh yeah, and
That is
and
that is a pest, isn't it?
Yeah, we had an issue. There's a school high tunnel that over the summertime, some cats found out that there was some nice loose soil in there, and they kind of went in and did their business all summer long. And the kids came back excited to grow in the fall, and there had to be a complete soil remediation done. It was not a fun time. Thankfully, that wasn't my high tunnel, and I only am telling you this secondhand. But oh boy, what a nightmare that was. But yeah, so just think about cats because, especially if you live in a suburban area and there's a lot of people letting their house cats run around, great for rodent control, really bad for garden.
So I'll tell you what, now that we kind of discussed some of the places to put your raised bed garden, let's talk about some of the material costs. Um, you can go from relatively cheap, well, I'm not going to say cheap because nothing's really cheap right anymore, relatively low cost to very expensive. Like the expensive part is not a limit to how you can do this. So some of the materials that you can do, and keep in mind the depth and the cost in the labor to fill those beds with soil comes in too. So really calculate the depth that you need because that's going to be a lot more labor intensive than you might expect. It might be a lot more expensive than you might expect. But the depth and the width of that raised bed also plays a huge part in how much it's going to cost you. For instance, if you were to go with a 2x6x8 untreated lumber, that's not going to be too expensive. It's going to be kind of in the $4 to $7 range per board, probably. But untreated lumber will typically give you a lower lifespan. So that's going to start decomposing because you have a lot of, remember, fungal spores and things like that living in your soil. And those will have enzymes that will break down that wood. So untreated lumber is actually relatively cheaper than treated lumber, but you have to understand that untreated lumber will not last you as long as treated lumber.
That's true. And you can use treated lumber on a raised bed garden. We do recommend that you line treated lumber with landscape fabric. But what we don't want you to do is go out and collect some like old railroad ties or something like that. Anything that was treated back before I think 80s is when they outlawed creosote for that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But some of the old protectants they used to use it contained arsenic. So no railroad ties, but regular treated lumber that you get at the hardware store would be fine.
And it might be more expensive, but calculate it this way. You're looking at 3 to 5 years versus 20 plus years, right? So if it's half the cost, you might be better off paying that double the cost because you're going to get 4 times the life of that wood. So I have it documented as 20 plus years, and that might depend on how it's treated. There's all kinds of factors in there, but let's just say longer for sure. Um, whether it's twice as long or 4 times as long, who knows? All right, but it's going to last you longer, so it might be worth paying that extra cost. But that's for you to decide on how long you want to have it. How sure are you that's the perfect spot? You know, maybe you want to try something, especially if you're doing something that's not full sun. That might be like a tricky little thing to play with, and you might not hit the ideal spot, even doing all the research you want. It might take you a couple tries to figure out the best place to grow that lettuce head. So figure out what works for you. Other things you can do, I have oak. If you use oak, it's 10 years. What do you think about that one?
That sounds good.
Oak, 10 years. Cedar, 20 plus. Rough cut cedar. Concrete blocks, that's one that you don't see too often. Might not be the prettiest up top, but you can always put a cap on it. And then you can make them quite pretty. The nice thing about cinder blocks, easy to work with, nice and flat. heavy duty, good drainage. I haven't come across too many raised bed cinder block gardens, but I'm surprised. What about you, Karen?
I've seen a couple mostly at schools. Wheeling Middle School's garden has concrete raised beds, and they work fairly well. They've been pretty sturdy, even with kids climbing all over them. So yeah, they've been great. And the thing with concrete is it is porous, and so sometimes when you overwater your garden, if you have a lot of kids, then the pores in the concrete can actually pull some out.
Yes.
But there is that hole in that concrete that can be used to grow other things, or it can be covered over and it can serve as an insulator. So if you're
Mm.
growing in a place, let's say you have it in the middle of a parking lot, that sun reflection coming up on that concrete, it's going to heat that up. But that little airspace in the middle, if you have that sealed off, can actually serve as an insulator between the exterior sun beating on it and the heat inside the soil.
That is a great point. And it can work the other way to your advantage too. If you're looking to extend the growing season and you put some kind of hoop on top of it, now you have even root protection. So that's a clever way to do that. That is a major advantage to the concrete block that I didn't consider. But guess what? You got 20 plus years and it's cheap. It's on the
Yeah.
cheaper side of things. You can also use pavers, maybe if you like the look of them. Might cost a little extra, but you have the aesthetics there if you so wish. But again, a lot of materials. It doesn't have to be 2 feet deep. It doesn't have to be 3 feet deep. It could be 6 inches. What are those blocks? 8 inches high or something like that.
That I don't know.
Sounds about right. So you stack a couple of those, and you're already foot and a half. Three of those, and 2 feet. So makes for nice depth if you want it, and a nice shallow one if you're not too worried about it. So if you have something that does a little bit more shallow roots, like we were saying with lettuce, that might be an ideal way to get some nice lettuce in the right place. So those are some of the advantages of raised bed gardens, and looking at the construction material is really going to help make it worth your while if you're selling it, or even if you just wanted to have a hobby that's not terribly expensive.
Yeah, and if you are, um, if you have trouble getting down to a garden, let's say that maybe you are just older and you have trouble getting down on the ground and back up again, or if you're in a wheelchair, tabletop raised bed gardens are another great option to allow you to continue gardening but at a place where it's more comfortable for your body to reach it. There's a lot of great plans out there to make sure you get the right height. I know that some of the raised bed gardens that they've designed in the past have been a little too deep for wheelchair use. So keep in mind what your comfortable reach is and how much space is going to be between you and the table from where you're trying to reach it when you're putting that in so that you're not causing yourself shoulder stress or something like that. Make sure you can reach it. And like Dan was saying earlier, when you're trying to decide how big your garden is, you need to think more, not just about how deep. 6 inches if you're growing lettuces, but if you want to grow something bigger, I kind of lean towards the deeper ones, like 10 to 18 inches, just because I like to have that flexibility if I want to grow something a little bit with a deeper root system, or especially if you're growing it on a surface that doesn't have access to extra soil underneath. But also think about your reach. My husband has some super long monkey arms. Um, and I don't. I have much shorter arms, and so for me to reach across the same span that he would, I would need a much narrower bed system than he would. So keep in mind what your own stature is, and if your body type doesn't match what the standards are, would just make it to fit you. If you need it a little bit higher, if you need it a little bit deeper, whatever makes your body more comfortable, that's what you need to build it to. And that's the great thing about raised beds is the flexibility of them.
And you know what? Here's another thing to think about. It's something that I never really thought. It's not as intuitive as you would think. If you are building a raised bed up against a fence or up against a wall,
Oh,
You got
yeah.
you got to understand, you can't walk around it to reach it from all sides. You have one side that you're reaching.
So
So
make that like a half bed
make it so that you can reach the back of the bed, because
comfortably.
I think comfortably, yes, that is true. And
Because you might be able to reach over that when they're small and get really stretched over there to get to the edge. But when that tomato plant's 6 feet tall and you're trying to get to the back side of it, that gets a little overwhelming.
or trying to pull those weeds that have really really deep roots.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yep.
so you need the leverage. so think about that. If it's up against a fence, if it's up against a wall, you might be doing half of the length that you might think you need
Yeah.
or that you're used to. So, and if you're not doing full sun, chances are it's got some kind of barrier. It might not, but it could. It could in that case.
Also keep in mind that the sun moves throughout the year. So what's full sun in the wintertime may not be full sun in the summertime. So if you're going to go out and
Yeah,
measure where you have full sun at this time of year, know that come July, things might look a little different. So you really have to pay attention to
that is a good point.
how the earth is tilted and where you're located in that tilt.
So maybe now is not the best time to do that research that we talked about early on. But but I mean, you could probably get a ballpark idea. You
You can
know,
get an idea, but it does change, especially if you have a small area you're working with. It may be better to, and it just some people have seen put them up on wheels and they just move them around. Like I saw
oh
one
wow,
picture, it was like a bunch of garden carts that all got chained together and they drag them around so it stays in the sun. And it's like, hey, brilliant, you've got to do what works for your area. And every and see that's the thing. It's like every person's garden is different. There are no two gardens that are the same, no two farms that are the same. It's just there's always different characteristics and different people running them. So you have to allow yourself flexibility and don't be like me. Don't be a perfectionist. Gardening is not a perfect thing and it never will be. And you're just going to drive yourself crazy if you expect it to be perfect.
right, right. Good point. Good point. Just to kind of complete the garden, we talked about location, we talked about materials, talked about depth. Let's talk about media. What you're putting in there, right? So, what are the three most common things to put in a raised bed garden? Peat moss, compost, vermiculite, regular soil, and all those things have different costs.
It's more
And
than three, Dan.
I threw in regular soil in there because I thought, that one was easy. So three things that are difficult to get, and then the one that's like right there.
Yeah.
But you have a variety of things to put in there. If I shouldn't have said I threw in regular soil, but we did say that one of the advantages of building a raised bed garden was to get away from that. So let us get away from that. So let's just go with peat moss, vermiculite, and compost.
And so, I'm going to play devil's advocate here and say you should get away from peat moss too.
Okay. So
And go
close.
with like coco coir or something like that, because it is more sustainable and it's basically taking a waste product from production of coconut, which was something we eat, and it is the fibrous husk that's then ground and decomposed a little bit, and it's very similar to peat moss. So I would try to lean away from peat. Peat's highly acidic, but it takes a long time for peat to be created. It is very water absorbent, and so that's great. But I tend to lean away from that.
Peat moss isn't necessarily the most cost effective way to do it either. Peat moss, according to my sources here, will have a cost of anywhere from $15 to $25 per 2 cubic square feet. So if you think about, right, remember we talked about the depth and how much it can add up and how much labor that you could put into that. Well, a whole bed of peat moss is going to be very, very expensive. If you're looking at the cost of vermiculite, though, vermiculite is going to cost you actually even more, $30 to $50. Really, the most cost effective way to put media into a raised bed garden is compost. What do you think?
Oh yeah, compost, compost, compost all the way.
And compost, I've heard people swear that there is no too much compost threshold. Like you could grow almost pure compost as long as it's composted.
Yes, as long as it is composted, because you got to keep in mind that the decomposition process is a nitrogen sink. And if your plants need nitrogen and your decomposing ground is taking away all the nitrogen, you're not going to have very healthy plants. So you got to make sure that it has been composted. It's not just raw organic material that you're throwing in there.
Yeah. Think about what you have accessible to you though. If you have a compost bin that's been sitting in your backyard for years, decades, right? It's just been, you're constantly adding to it. It's like that's where you put all your leaves. That's where you put your scraps. That is just the regular decomposition decades. That's probably really good stuff. Dig into that, fill in your raised bed garden. If your compost bin or pile is not decades old, then you might want to amend it with things like peat moss or not peat moss, right, Karen? Vermiculite. Do you have media that is well drained and won't be a nitrogen sink as decomposing organic material? But organic material is kind of one of the best things to have in a growing situation because it does allow nutrients to stick around longer. It does allow for better drainage.
Well, and it's also, the earth is a living entity and it is a home for other living entities. And so when you're looking at a garden, when you have food to feed all of those microorganisms that create symbiotic and other relationships with your plants, that can actually help improve the health of your plants, because if you have the proper little critters living in the soil eating all of the decaying material, then you may have better health. All of these microorganisms interact with one another. They create channels for drainage in the soil. They help transfer minerals into plant available minerals. And they also help to invite more beneficials. So, making sure you have a healthy soil environment in your garden is really important. And adding compost regularly to your soil is very critical, especially in a raised bed system where you're typically planting much more densely than you would in a normal garden. You're going to be utilizing a lot more nutrients, and you've got to be able to replenish that material each year by adding extra compost. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.